Hey everyone, I'm Hanif Fazal, and I'm on the chopping block at visceralchange.org.
Welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of The Chopping Block. As always, we are looking to bring you some good information around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today, we have one of the leading practitioners in terms of this work, Hanif Fazal. Hanif is the co-founder and managing partner of the Center for Equity and Inclusion in Portland, Oregon. Hanif, what's going on, man? Happy to have you here.
Not much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I appreciate the time to connect.
Yeah, for sure, man. Really, really looking forward to having this discussion. One thing about the chopping block we kind of mentioned a little bit offline is that it does a good job of raising awareness in certain fields and disciplines where folks may not necessarily think DEI has a space. And I don't get to discuss some matters with actual practitioners who are rooted in the work very often. And so every time I get the chance, I get excited to do so. And so I'm really hoping you are able to provide some insight on what CEI does, talk a little bit about your journey, and maybe tackle some of the challenging questions and discussions that people don't really want to talk about. So really, really looking forward to that. Let me start with the first question, and hopefully you can appreciate my investigative journalism with this question. But Hanif, you are of Indian and Mexican descent, correct?
That is it. That's true.
Dad Indian, mom Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you were born in Chicago. All right, follow me here. You were born in Chicago and raised in Portland, where you moved at 3 years old. Your father immigrated from Tanzania to India to Chicago. Is correct?
Impressive. Yes.
Oh, look at that.
Nice. All right.
In that, Hanif, there's a lot of experience that comes with that. I'm going to toss the microphone back to you now that I can kind of brush my shoulders off a little bit.
Yeah.
Talk about growing up as sort of a biracial, multi-ethnic child with respect to those specific identities. A lot of times when we hear about biraciality, it's usually black and white. Here in Tucson, you hear a lot about, white and Latinx as well. Talk about this Indian and Mexican relationship in terms of your identity, what that was like growing up, and then how did your familial shape, cultures, experiences inform, impact, or shape the experiences you had growing up in Portland at large?
Oh, I love that. Well, obviously, nothing has shaped me more than my ethnic roots in terms of how I see the world, and that is an interesting interplay. And there's some parallels actually. Culturally, I think there's a lot of parallels. And in terms of both my parents growing up, there's some parallels around how I experience that ethnicity. And so let me say this. So let me go back to my grandparents just for a second, because I think
Yeah,
that's
please.
really kind of grounding in how I see and understand race. And so on my dad's side, he's fourth generation Indian, born in Tanzania, Africa. When my grandmother was born, when my grandmother was pregnant, it was discovered that she was having twins. At the
Mm.
same time, with my dad, so my dad was a twin. So at the same time, my grandfather's sister could not have kids. And so it was decided that one of the twins, upon birth, would go to the aunt, more or less.
Because
So
she couldn't have kids.
she couldn't have kids.
That's right.
So a while back, when they were born, my dad ended up being the one who was chosen to go with the aunt. So a while back, I had an interview with my father, and just kind of getting his whole life story. And I've known about that story for a long time. And I asked him, "Hey, Dad, why did they choose you versus Nuzzer Uncle?" And he looked at me, and I'm not sure if it was just the way he said it or what he said, but he just looked at me almost like it was obvious, and he just kind of rubbed his skin, and he goes, "I had lighter skin." So
Mm.
what's how that plays out, and one of the ways it shapes me is that so my father, unknowing to him, then is adopted by his aunt,
Mm.
and by all accounts, his and everyone else's accounts that I've known in the family, becomes like the biggest mama's boy. Like the mom just dotes over him and loves him, and he loves her, and then she would pass at a young age in a very kind of traumatic way for him.
Oh no.
And my father then was returned to home, to his home, and in also not the most kind of more maybe in a definitely in a traumatic way over time.
Mm.
It's that he discovers, it's told to him, hey, she's
Wow.
not really your mom, this is my mom, all that kind of stuff. So very long story short,
Wow.
that would send my dad reeling, and in a way that he would never quite, for me, ever see him fully recover from. And so, some of that anger and some of that frustration was taken out in all kinds of ways in our own family systems. I
Right.
think my dad never really fully came to grips with the impacts of that, certainly how all that happened. And I think culturally, he's not growing up in a generation where he goes and says, well, I should go see a therapist around this, like,
Mm.
uh, so all of that has a huge, so one of the things that makes me think about all the time, I get like, well, is white supremacy something that's just a US centered thing or a Europe centered thing? And I always feel like white supremacy was, Europe's greatest import in some
Mm.
ways,
Mm.
in terms of like what it was able to mass. And so it's interesting to me that even in a small town in Tanzania, Africa, white supremacy is playing out, right? And that experience would then shape my life in a big way, shape my
Yeah.
relationship with my father, it shaped our experience of our family. And so before I even knew it, white supremacy was playing a number on me, my family, all of that. So he does immigrate to Chicago. He meets my mother, who's full Mexican. And on my grandmother's side, my memory of my grandmother, one of my most kind of impactful memory of my grandmother is when she's passing. And as she's passing, we were all around her, and her last kind of, as she was passing, she was kind of losing her mental faculties and all that. And so she was just only speaking in Spanish. Uh,
Mm.
and I was just noting that I couldn't understand her. And my grandmother had done what many Latinas had done at the time, which was assimilate her children as much as possible.
Mm.
Uh, so cut the language, cut the culture, cut all of those kinds of things out from my mom's experience growing up. And so I grew up in a home then that was that was then passed down to me,
Right.
where um, I did not feel the sense of cultural connection to the Latinx my Latinx roots, and even some of the kind of more basic cultural norms. Certainly, the language and not having access to the language would be a huge, huge piece for me. So, I grew up in these two homes where, when you think about the role of white supremacy and you think about the ways in which uh, different communities of color are coping or dealing or impacted with it, I I grew up in this home where it's like, here we are, where it's on one hand, a push to assimilation on my mom's side, and
Mm-hmm.
not really understanding kind of what that means on my dad's side, um, kind of reeling from kind of in some ways the rage and anger of the impacts, but not always even knowing that it's coming from that, right?
Right.
And so then here I come and I'm born, right,
Yeah.
uh, into this home, and so there was a very dominant kind of Indian kind of culture in the house to some extent,
Sure.
but also now I'm firstborn U.S., and then we move out to Portland, Oregon, that is predominantly white, and vastly. We grew up in a white suburb out here called Tigard, and so here we have it then, right, where I'm not as connected as I want to be culturally, um, on the Latinx side of things. I am connected on the Indian side, but my dad's anger has me feeling like I want to disconnect from him,
Right.
all things,
Sure.
all things dad. And now I'm in a completely wide environment where everything from my name to any cultural things that are going on at home to are all not welcomed in a really kind of very overt manner, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
here is then the experience of a brown person, right? Like of like both where do I and a mixed brown person. So
Yeah.
I hear this all the time with mixed folks of like not feeling a sense of belonging in either culture, uh,
Mm-hmm.
or not feeling a
Yeah.
sense of connection. And certainly there is that experience. And then at the same time, all the usual stuff of not clear, clear markers of not being accepted in terms of a predominantly white culture, which
Yeah.
so that's a long and short kind of
Yeah. Yeah. And so your father found out about his youthful experience, right? The adoption as an adult. Like you were already around and the family already
well,
started.
he found out as a child. So
Oh, he found out as a child. Okay.
he moved back to his mom. I think his adopted mom, his aunt, passed away when he's 7, I think.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
And then, but and you were saying he never was able to really grapple with it to the point where it actually manifested in the household when he had his own family as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. 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 Wow. That, that's powerful. And, you know, I've been to Portland a number of times and you talk about it being a very white area. And, you know, we'll talk maybe a little bit about that as we go on. But there's a lot of unresolved trauma racially within Portland. And it's always difficult for areas to begin doing the work if they have yet to reconcile with some of their own internal issues. It's very, excuse me, it's very reflective of the larger cosm of the United States, which has never really done a great job of reconciling slavery or, you know, the Trail of Tears, and as a result, finds ways to kind of work around it rather than having that discussion, which is really at the heart of a lot of the good stuff you do with CEI, which we'll get to in a second. But I want to stick in this particular time frame, sort of in your youth, your adolescence, your young adulthood. You received your bachelor's in applied science and psychology from Portland State.
You got it. You got it.
Okay. At this point in your life, Hanif, what was the plan? Were you always justice oriented? Were you trying to move into psychology? Sort of where was your mind here based on sort of your perceived trajectory when you went and received your bachelor's?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because one of the things that happened with the childhood growing up is, and I think this happens to, I see this when I was working with kids. I spent 20 years working with kids, families of color and community that, when the kiddos hit this teenage years, all that kind of stuff, they're dealing with all kinds of barriers. You start to see them coping. You start to see
Yes.
the anger manifesting in all kinds of ways. And so the same thing in some ways happened with me, which is, one of the impacts of how things played out was my family system kind of collapsed. So my father left by the time I was in 6th grade, moved to BC. My mom and was raising me and my 2 sisters on minimum wage. Just at the time it was $3.50 an hour, working out at 7-Eleven. My dad
Mm,
wasn't out support any of that, so we were really doing what we could to just make it by. And then I was turning into this very angry kind of brown kid, right? Like
sure.
this idea of just reeling from what's going on at home, being in these school systems that were just constantly an experience of rejection and exclusion and just marginalization at every kind of level. And at that age, all there is get more and more angry. And with a mom who was, trying to do all she could to hold on to it all. And one of the things that ended up happening for a variety of reasons is my entire family system fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I would find myself, my mom moved away, and I would find myself parentless in that moment, or without any living on my own. And so I had a girlfriend at the time who was 18. When I was
Mm.
16, my mom left, and so she could get
Huh.
on a lease, and she was also getting kicked out of her home. So my mom left, my dad's out of the picture, my sisters are gone. I had no place to go. I was myself making like 350, 375 an hour, something like that.
Right.
And so we got into this very low income housing complex in downtown Portland called the Civic, which is ironic right now because it's this massive condo, really nice condo sitting right across from where the Portland Timbers play. But at
Oh,
the time, it was kind of like as stereotypical of an image as you can get in terms of a low income housing complex. And
gotcha.
one of the experiences I had there at 16, was that I had always grown up poor, and especially when my dad left, this was poverty at a whole nother.
Mm.
This was, you walk out, like everywhere you look, people are just trying to survive. And that's whether it's the prostitution going on in the hallway, the drug dealer across the way, whether it was the
Oh,
homelessness and houselessness all around me. So I had never really been in a situation where really no one was thinking like, well, one day I'm going to get out of this. One day I'm going to be somebody. Like there was none of that. Every day was just like, how do I just make it to the next day? Like, how do I just
right.
next day? So that experience of being in that, like both two places of survival, I actually think is as difficult as the civic was on me. It was not nearly as difficult as my education experience. Like if you want to talk about like what was more harmful, being in the civic and without parents and just trying to figure it out, at least when we were trying to figure it out, we were all kind of like, fuck it.
Yeah.
Like we were all
Yeah.
kind of like, hey, everyone, like just don't get in each other's way. Don't do whatever. Just like, we all just were kind of in this place of survival. But
That's right.
on the at school, that it was how I had kind of bought in. Like school was kind of like a place I was supposed to do well. I was supposed to be able to make, but it was at every turn reminding me that I did not look like what success was. I did not sound like what success
Mm.
was. I was
The
not.
messaging.
Yeah, and it was so clear. Like sometimes very overt in all the subtle ways, right? So
Right.
for me, at that time, one thing that I became really clear about, at least subconsciously, was that these systems like school or all the other things in community that I was part of were just not really ever set up for anybody that was looking like me. Like I couldn't articulate it in any kind of way, but I knew that school wasn't for me. I
Yeah.
knew it wasn't like I wasn't the poster child of what success looks like there.
Right.
And then I was also in this space of like really survival. Like, hey, this is what it means to survive. So over time, I think, so when I managed to find my way through it all, and I think when I got out of college, I wasn't totally sure. I had no idea. Like at that time, diversity, equity, inclusion didn't even really exist. Like
Mm.
certainly maybe diversity, we probably were using at that time. But to me, all I knew, I did have this kind of almost hyper preoccupation with this idea of um, what does it mean to create spaces where we can thrive,
Yes.
right? And what do we
Yes.
need to do? Because it had such a traumatic kind of like impact on me. So my initial stuff out of the gate from school was who do I know who's in survival that I can support one way or the other? And that was kids. It was kids, families, and communities. So my
Mm.
initial, when I came out of school, my whole focus was on the only thing that I knew, which was kids in that sense. Like I could relate to kids and families who are really struggling. I could relate
Yes.
to the ones who weren't doing well in school or teachers
Right.
like weren't school material one way or the other. Like those kinds of kids who people would kind of put to the side, which were pretty
Like
much
wrote off. Yeah.
were kids, all kids of color, but also the ones who were really struggling, like who were not like, I'm going to prove you wrong, but more were like, well, fine, fuck it, I'm gone then too.
Uh
Like
huh.
those kids, I loved working with those kids. And so that's where initially I thought my place in the world was how do I help these kids and families and communities figure out how to navigate the system and step into a possibility that I see for them, but they don't see for themselves. And
Yes.
one thing I'll say is like my name actually has a meaning. It means true believer.
Oh.
And for that name has guided me in a lot of different ways. But at that period of time in particular, I feel like believing in kids and in their possibility, believing in families and our communities and its possibility was kind of the thing that I was so grounded in.
Yes. It's huge.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I did some work prior to even entering the world of higher ed. I did work with young kids as well, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. And, when I did that, one thing I learned about myself is that I had a knack for helping people and a desire for helping people, whether they be 5 to 7, or 9, or whether they be 15, 17, 19, 25. What I recognize when I reflect back is I remember that I was excited that I was able to work with the kids and they really took to me in a certain way during the school hours. But when the mom and dad came, everything kind of changed. It's easy to kind of not forget who I am, but the rules of engagement, right, and the authority figures shift. And maybe similar to you, I saw myself saying, there are a slew of people out there who don't have mom or dad to come show up or anybody to come help redirect or course correct. And I want to be that person for those folks who might be floating around the college area, sleeping out of their car or, on their last penny trying to make it work, that I can really be of assistance to. So I'd be curious, Hanif. I want to move into CEI in just a second, but you spent a lot of time in working with the youth and families and even K-12, 20 plus years. What did you learn from that particular environment? And are there any relationships that you've seen between your time in that particular sector and then later the work you're going to produce with CEI?
I mean, I learned so much. So the thing that is, there's two things that I think are the primary thing connected to CI's work in D&I was that, if you're working with kids, we created, I got a chance to create a program called Step Up, and it was
Mm-hmm.
a program that was providing kind of extended day services to kids who were really struggling in school. So it was academic supports, mentoring, all this kind of stuff. So we spent a lot of very personal time with kids. We would take them away for, week camp and get to know them at a very deep and meaningful level, really challenge them in lots of different ways. We were in their homes, doing family visits. And one of the things that always stuck with me was you got to see that the kids, although, and the families and communities were kind of identified as the problem in kind of subtle ways, like a problem that we have to fix. Like they've got
Right.
problems we have to fix, right?
Right.
Um, that when you were with them, you were like, nah, no, like no, the problem is not here. Um,
Yeah.
like there's no lack of caring about education in communities of color. In fact, like
No.
what was always heartbreaking is that parents believed in education for their kids way more than the education system believed in educating that their kids
Yeah.
were open to being educated. We're actually committed to them. Like the commitment to education, you couldn't measure the commitment that parents of color had to education compared to the commitment education had to their kids of color. Like you
Yes.
can't, there's
No.
not even a comparison. And so it was heartbreaking to see parents banking on, believing in, like continuing to put their kids in the systems that were really not committed
Yes.
in a real way. And so that was, and you get to see not just the caring, but you get to see the determination, the intelligence, you get to see the heart and the grind. I mean, all of what is in our communities, and you were really clear, like this is not the issue. Like this
No.
is here is not where the issue is. In fact, here's where the solutions are probably going to lie if we'd actually listen to them. And to me, then the transition is, I literally over 20 years across the country with
Mm.
the home program, but then would do intensive work with kids across the country and families and communities. And I had this one moment where we were working with these kids, and one night of the program, we get these kids in smaller groups, and they would talk about some of the barriers that were going on in their lives. And this one, I'll never forget, this one African American girl started sharing, and more or less, she was talking about how her mom was dying, and from crack addiction.
Mm.
And as I was listening to it, um, we did the best job of kind of wrapping ourselves around her and providing supports for her, all those kinds of things. And it was amazing to watch kind of the way in which community comes together to hold someone up when they're really struggling. I think that you just find in communities of color that are beautiful.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, though, one of the things I realized when I walked out of it, or that room, I thought about two things. I thought about her mom, and I thought about the way in which this world has put barrier after barrier after barrier in front of Black women. And
Yes.
I wonder about at what point did mom say, like, okay, like it's just too much, and this is for whatever reason the way that she decided to cope. And when did she lose that sense
Mm-hmm.
of self? You know, at what point did the chipping away of all these systems and what it does to Black women? So that's one thing I started wondering about.
Mm.
What, where, and what was missing? What was, you know, where were the supports lacking? How was she not set up? All these things. The thing that really hit me as much as that was I realized I have now heard this same story probably 1,000 times,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And it's like a, and so if I knew that it wasn't within the issue wasn't in the community, and
Mm.
but I knew, give me a skin color, give me a zip code, and it is that predictable about
Right.
what is going to happen to a kid, right?
Mm.
Put this, tell me the skin, yeah, give me name, zip code, and tell me the darkness of that skin. Tell me if they're legal or they're not legal, you know, like I can tell you with high degree of predictability what. And so then I started thinking, like, it's not these kids, then what is it? Like, what is in play here that like makes these disparities not just so persistent but so predictable? And
Mm.
the bigger question I had is like, hey, am I participating in this in ways that I don't know? Like, am I perpetuating things that I don't want to know? So as much as I loved, and I will always love, direct service with kids, and actually where my heart is, and I think maybe is the best thing, the most meaningful thing, the work I've ever been a part of is being in those circles and working with kids.
Yeah.
There felt like there needed to be, for me, an investigation into like, what is this system that we're part? I couldn't name it. I had no language.
Mm-hmm.
I had no sense of like, if you had asked me what systemic racism was at that moment, I wouldn't have been able to tell you that that
Right.
existed, like any of that. I just knew it wasn't our fault.
Right.
I just knew
Right.
it wasn't our fault, and I knew it was predictable. I knew something wasn't setting up, and I knew from growing up in upper middle class white Portland, even though I didn't have the money there, that's where we grew up, in these upper middle class suburbs, that
Sure.
school systems look phenomenally different at Beaverton High School than it did at Roosevelt High School. Like I could
Right.
put those together. Like, this is like the education, the setup, everything is so
Mm-hmm.
different here compared to
Yep.
there. So those things started to, like, I could put all these things are adding up together. I just didn't have language or anything like that to help me understand what
Yeah.
is actually.
That's critically important. I was sharing a similar story the other day. I had the pleasure of keynoting this conference, and sort of as the last day, as the opening keynote of their final day. And you know, one of the questions is sort of, you know, how did you come to the work, essentially? And you know, as I was sharing my experience, a piece of that is similar to what you said. I remember coming up in the projects. You know, long story short, I wound up going to graduate school, and you know, I didn't have a grasp on racism as a structure by any means. I knew what it was by definition one. You know, my race is better than your race. I didn't know definition two, right? The sociological component of power, privilege, and prejudice, et cetera. That piece I didn't have yet. But I always knew that something was off in my relationship, sometimes with white folks and what they felt comfortable saying. It triggered something, but it wasn't enough for me to end a relationship or lose my mind. But I knew something shouldn't, yeah, something you're not supposed to say that, or something's different here. I didn't hit the same way when my black friend said it, for example. And it was because I didn't have the language. And when I got to my master's program specifically, I began getting the language around DEI, words like microaggression, words like privilege, words like intersectionality, systems of power. I mean, then I was like, oh, okay. Now it all makes sense. So the language, as you named, is really, really important. And sometimes we tend to lose sight of that, you know.
Yeah, if you don't, I feel like language and framework, like if you don't have a framework to understand what's going on, then, and especially because racism and systemic racism is so both overt. Once you have a lens, you can see it, but it can be subtle. You don't, it just
Mm-hmm.
never feels right, right?
Yeah,
And without
yeah,
naming it, it's interesting.
yeah, for sure, for sure. So, okay, so you then co-founded CEI in 2015. So you all have been making some strides and moving for a good while now, almost 10 years. tie this together for me. You talked a little bit about it, but what was the impetus? What was the turning point that made you say, you know what, I'm stepping away from these organizations. I'm gonna found my own, and really start to make a difference. What was that turning point for you?
Well, I think for me, I was Step Up was housed in a larger nonprofit, and so one of the things that ended up happening is when I got a chance to start Step Up, um, we basically got a set of dollars to start this program, and I was early on really committed to having people from the community be part of the program. Like, again, without a lot of language around it, I just knew like, hey, we need to be the ones mentoring our own kids, kind of thing.
Yes.
And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the things that I did was it was an all white nonprofit that I was a part of. So very quickly we started having this influx of black and brown folks from the community, right, in there
Mm-hmm.
who were operating differently, who were talking differently, who were culturally different, all that kind of stuff, right?
Uh
And
huh.
then the program started to get both national recognition and local recognition. And so it started growing. And so in a very short amount of time, it almost doubled the size of the organization.
Wow.
And so like within 3 years, we were now in multiple high schools. We were, I think the staff was getting larger and larger, all that kind of stuff. So what we ended up doing is before we had any kind of like real roadmap around that stuff, we knew we had to do something. And then Courageous Conversations about race came into Portland School District. And
Mm.
so we were early on what they called a beacon school for that work. And what
Okay.
Courageous Conversations did was it gave us some agreements and it gave us some conditions around race. And we really took that and then ran with it, almost created our own kind of process with it in one way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and we spent about 7 years doing what now I would call really transformational work, where we looked at everything from not just everything from how we did marketing to how we did HR to how we did
Right.
services to kids and family. And over a seven to almost a decade of time, there was a transformation of the organization. And you
Yes.
get to really see like, hey, culturally, it feels different in here. We operate differently. We act differently. People of color are really thriving in this organization in a way that they hadn't experienced before. It wasn't perfect
Yes.
by any means. There were lots of mistakes, but that idea um, really gave me this idea of like, hey, there's something here. And so other organizations started hearing about it and asking like, hey, would you mind helping us one way or the other? And that's where the impetus of CI started happening, is where I started having this idea of like, hey, wait a minute. At the time, there was like just outside of crazy conversations around race in education, all there was like a 2 day training or a
Mm-hmm.
3 day training, whatever it ends up being. But nobody had really thought about like, hey, we need to think about this long term, like over multiple years. We need to be really building capacity around common language and framework.
Right.
We need to be able to address kind of how this sits in the culture of an organization. And then we need to infuse it into our operations like that. And that's going to take some time. So
Yes.
I had an idea to do this. I was able to get local foundation support. Meyer Memorial Trust is kind of one of the ones who kind of really took a chance on me. And really, I don't know why. I was like, it's actually a funny race moment where I I was like unconfident. I was still unconfident. I had this great idea. I'd never run a for-profit business or any consulting company, any of that kind of stuff. But I knew that like this was the right idea, and this is what I want to do with my life, and
Mm-hmm.
this was the right thing. I had foundations who were willing to back about 3/4 of a year of funding, and so I knew I could get through the first 3 quarters.
Yeah.
And basically, my pitch was, let me work with 10 organizations, five a year, to those foundations, and let me try on these a kind of a new way of doing equity work. And I kind of found 5 organizations, but I was still so nervous to start it. And I had
Yeah. Of
at the
course.
time was two, and I was doing fine in my own. So I went to the CEO of our nonprofit, who was a white guy, and I was like, "Hey, look, this is a great idea. I know this is going to work. I built Step Up. I can build a program, this and that. But can we house this in the nonprofit? Can this be kind of a funding part, like a for-profit arm, all this kind of stuff? And I was trying to convince him of that. And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, you know, Hanif, the difference between you and a white entrepreneur, he was
Uh-oh.
like, a white entrepreneur feels like he's on an escalator, and that escalator is moving up. So even if he falls,
He's still going up.
he's still moving up.
That's
He
right.
thinks he's fine. You feel like you act like you're on a slippery staircase, and the only way to go is down.
Mm.
This thing was
Wow.
this thing was like, this is mission drift for our organization. This is mission drift for our organization. And so you can either continue to, at that time I kind of promoted to associate director. You can continue to move on as associate director, or you're going to have to go out on your own. One of the two, but make a decision.
Wow.
At that time, my co-founder was from any care, so a black woman. Now pair that with a different way of looking at it. In some ways, same way, but her thing was like, Hanif, this is what you meant to do. Like, we can do this together. Like, let's figure out how to do this together. You got to believe in yourself. You got to this and that, all that kind of stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
it was just a warmth and a belief, and where with him, it was kind of like, let me just tell you how you, and there was truth to all of that.
Yeah.
But with
Yeah.
her, there was like a real belief in what I was up to, a belief in the need for our community. And once she started organizing it that way, like, our community needs this.
Yeah.
Like, we need you to be stepping up right now here. And I'm willing to go along this ride with you on this, because we need this.
That's right. That's right.
And
That's right.
we are capable of this.
That's right.
And so out we went. And there was the start of CEI. We had 5 organizations that me and Froini had believed were open to this idea of transformation. We told the foundations, give us a year and we'll be able to build base foundation, common language and framework, connection to these issues, and start kind of making inroads into the culture.
Love
Of course,
it.
way longer than a year.
Of course.
Learned all kinds of things in the journey of it all, but that was the start of it all.
That's amazing. Now, is your co-founder still with you at the organization?
Absolutely. Roini's
Nice,
still
nice.
there
Roini.
with me, Roini Kiros, and we've kind of gone on to spin off another business that's now working on building inroads into development.
I saw that. We're gonna tackle that on the back end. We'll come back to that. I want to give you some space on that for sure. That's exciting. These ventures. In addition, I noticed that you have a founder, a co-founder title on a lot of different things. From certificates to what we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's exciting. It's very clear that you're not somebody who people say, oh, Hanif says he does this. No, you're demonstrable. It's definitely something that we can point to and see, which is amazing. Now, as an academic, as a researcher, my work is in organizational development, organizational theory, multicultural organizational theory, all that good stuff. And so I always considered myself a systems-centered researcher, a systems-centered practitioner. I'm very much a believer in organizational design, social design, and the ways in which that it impacts our behavior, with our behavior being a product of that social design. One thing that CEI states, and that you all state, is that the work is grounded in a systemic racism framework, excuse me. Break that down a little bit, Hanif, for the listeners who may not know what systemic racism is, especially as it manifests as a framework.
Yeah, I appreciate that. When I think about a system, because we use words like system or institutional racism, and
right.
For us, that makes sense. But for most people, like, that's just language. That's just weird. Right. So one of the ways I think about a system is like any system, like a human system. For our human system work, there's a muscular system. There's
that's right.
Nervous system. There's
vascular.
All these things that are operating within the body to make it work, right? And so I think the same thing when I think about a corporation or a nonprofit or a foundation, whatever it ends up we're working with. There are these systems that operate within that make it function,
That's right.
or help it function. And when I think about those systems, one of the things that we've recognized is that the way that we've built these systems, while it's helped an organization to function, it's unintentionally and oftentimes very intentionally, historically very intentionally, and at this
Mm-hmm.
point, oftentimes unconsciously, have been systems. These systems have been built in ways that, while it has created profit for the organization, it has exploited folks of color, or it
Mm.
has created these disparities that now it doesn't even have to try. Like right now, we talk with businesses and say, like, look, you don't have to try to create a racial disparity right now. It's actually built into the kind of fabric of the
Sure.
organization, right?
Sure.
So part of what we want, when I think about a system, I think about how a business operates, right? Like how a nonprofit operates. And when I think about that, then I think it's built really three things kind of help. When I think about it, very simple, make a complex thing simple. I think there's three things that help a business function. There's individuals
Mm-hmm.
that are operating in the business or in the nonprofit foundation, whatever it ends up being. There's the culture,
Mm-hmm.
kind of organizational norms, narratives, belief systems that are at play. And then there's policies and practices and protocols, right? And those
Right.
three things are always operating kind of together, one way or the other.
Yes.
So, what we are trying to do in an organization, we think about like systemically or race, is like, hey, there are, um, how do we help these three kind of, how do we help individuals build the requisite kind of racial conscious that they need to understand how my individual interpersonal interactions may be perpetuating racial disparities that I don't want to be perpetuating. Like, what's my
Yes.
individual role here? Both, where does my individual bias show up? Where does my actions show up? All those kinds of things. But what does that mean for me?
Mm-hmm.
That and culturally, we want to be looking at, like, what are the ways in which we are operating, uh, culturally speaking, norms, behaviors, all that stuff, that are unintentionally marginalizing or unintentionally um, limiting the impact people of color can have in the organization, one way or the
Mm.
other.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, how does that show up in our policies and our practices, all of that.
Yes.
So for us, we think when we have to look at the whole system, we have to look at kind of all three levels of interaction and be able to put what we call race lens on it, like have people begin to really consider what are the racial impacts of the way we're organized culturally, what are the racial impacts of the ways we are, our policies and practice, the way we live our mission, the way we
Yes.
operationalize it, and my individual actions. What are the racial impacts? So to get folks into that space of even
Mm-hmm.
wanting that, there's a whole kind of level of consciousness raising that we have to do with folks over time. And we have to think about it kind of in a very strategic way. So there's a way we go about in organizations of working with leadership to understand their role, kind of make sure that up and down a system, there's common language and framework, a common commitment to this work,
Yes.
and that we're engaging key stakeholders in helping drive it in their organizations,
Yes.
leadership to ERGs to, all these different groups that may be showing up in the organization.
Huge.
Not specific enough. Sometimes I feel like I can talk in
Yeah.
ways
No,
that doesn't.
that's, yeah. Yeah. No, that nails it. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I had the pleasure of doing a TED talk a couple of years back, and then I was going to do another one when the pandemic hit, but they had to pause it. But while we were in the stages, I was in conversation with, the everybody's assigned a coach at that point, and so my coach, who was a woman who ran the entire piece, and she said, or event. I'll never forget it, man. It's advice that kind of stuck with me because it's popped up a few times since, just in different ways. She basically said to me, Sharad, I hear you, but in your message, you're talking to the 10%.
Mhm,
And that's the 10% of people who get it. I
mhm.
need you to find a way to connect to the 90. Right? I need
Right.
you to find a way to connect to the manager of Home Depot, to, the clerk at here in the West Coast, clerk at Safeway or Fry's, to the folks who are not in academic fields who you want to convince that this work is important. So, you talked about this idea of like systemic this or the systems this. Yeah, I mean, for folks like us that we get it because we also have the years of experience behind us. But at the same time, not everybody has that particular language and it can come off slightly esoteric. But I thought you did a great job of breaking that down as somebody who I'm always trying to be mindful of the ways in which words land, especially if we're working with organizations that aren't steeped in it the same way. I mean, I've had nonprofits tell me, small nonprofits, like, can you give us a different example, or can you deliver this a different way? Right. So I think what you shared there was really, really well said, and something that's going to land for a lot of listeners.
Well, yeah, one way to think about it is like, look, we're just not conditioned to really think about experiences of others outside of our own kind of identity. Like,
Yes.
and specifically racially, white folks are just not conditioned to think about the experiences of people of color, right? So they're not
Sure.
asking like, hey, what's the racial impacts of this or that, or all those kinds of things. And
That's
partly
right.
because there's a belief that we're all equal, we've all started equally, all we have to do is just kind of work hard, try hard, do
Bootstraps.
all that kind of stuff, and we
Mm-hmm.
can do it. And the reason we're not being successful is because there's some breakdown there. There's some breakdown in kind of individual
That's right.
commitment, agency, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it takes time. I think any kind of systemic kind of approach to things means that, and this is some of the challenges we get, which is organizations, no matter what organizations we want us to move really quickly to what do we do differently? How do we do this differently? What's the strategy?
Yeah.
And I believe we have to do things differently for this to really work. Like it's actually has to change, end up in behavior change.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, we have to understand, like, we have to be able to build a connection to like, what is this? Like one way I think about it is Amina, she's playing soccer, right? And so I've been working with her on she's playing club soccer now, and so it's like a whole nother level of like people are really a little too excited about, but I'm also recognizing she wants to play club soccer, she wants to get better, all this kind of stuff. So I was like, all right, that means, Amina, that we're going to have to practice outside of practice to catch you up to all these other kids, because she's been on the club for years, right?
That's right.
So we've been practicing, and like I'm showing her all these drills, I'm showing all, and she's getting better and better and better. But once you get to the game, she couldn't kind of put it together.
Yeah. Whole different beast. Yeah.
Like she kind of knew these skills and all that kind of stuff, and she knew like to go in this direction, all this kind of stuff. But some of it was confidence, but I also recognized it. But then I realized, oh, wait a minute. And this is kind of a weird thing. I'm like, Amina has never actually sat down and watched a soccer game. So she's never actually sat in the stands and watched how soccer is played.
Yeah.
Instead, she's learned all the technical things, right? Like, hey, I need to dribble to the right when someone comes to me. But when the game happens, she doesn't actually understand the game she's in.
Interesting, right? So perspective.
She can't put the tools she just can't put the tools to use, or any good use, because she doesn't see the game. She doesn't see the game that she's a part of.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I actually sat her on the bleachers and said, okay, I want you to watch that midfielder, because that's the position you play. Like, watch how she moves on the field. Watch when she goes. So when they tell you to go to the sideline, look, that's what going to the sideline means. Like that's right. The actual call, right? So the same thing occurs, I think, when we don't understand the game we're in. We think we think we know. We think so. So there's something about like helping people understand, like, hey, like pull themselves on the balcony in some sense and say, like, here's how this has been set up, right? Like, here's how what culture, like, if you can pull yourself out of it, here's what culture looks like when it's playing out in an organization.
Yeah.
Right. And here's who that helps and who's not. Let's give some language to it. Let's put some case, whatever it ends up being. So that then when they step back into the culture, like, okay, now I understand.
That's right.
This is what it means to be a white person, and how the culture looks and how it's benefiting. Because now I know what to look for. I know what it looks like. I know how I'm perpetuating it. Oh, this is what it looks like when it lives in a policy.
That's it. That's exactly it.
Okay, now I understand. This is when he's telling me to ask this question. This is the moment, and this is why I do it. But I wouldn't be able to do it if they didn't understand how the whole thing is set up.
That's right.
Play the whole game in that sense. Does that make sense?
That's it. And the fact of the matter is, right, I share with people, it's not right. It's not you who is inherently racist. It's this unchecked privilege you have that you receive that allows you to behave and become racist really whenever you want, at any point in time, if we're talking to white folks in particular, right? And, same goes for sexism and other identities that are really a product of this larger microcosm. And, it takes us to, because what is privilege by loose definition, other than there are things in the world we don't have to worry about if we don't want to, right? Especially because it doesn't impact our day to day negatively. So it requires a lot of times for us to kind of move out of that identity, almost as if you're looking at yourself sort of from a distance, objectively, in order to see, oh, okay, now I have a different understanding. And that's why I love the analogy, although it was reality, of your daughter sort of watching the game from a distance and saying, okay, here's what they mean, if when you say dribble to the right or to the sideline, and what a midfielder is supposed to do. Like I can appreciate that, because it really emphasizes the importance of stepping outside of oneself to have a better understanding of the landscape, right? of the setting. So one thing about CEI that's pretty abundantly clear to me, especially off of the framework being grounded in systemic racism, is that there's a very strong, if not chief, emphasis on race and racism. Mm-hmm. The unique thing though about DEI, especially the diversity component, is that it's a mosaic, right? More than anything, it's broad. It covers a lot of different identities. To which I tell people, you can give me 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. I'm not going to hit every identity there is. So I'm going to miss a couple, because, it's that vast. Hanif, have you and folks at CEI ever received any pushback from marginalized identities who feel like they're not represented in your work, that your work doesn't speak to them? And if so, maybe what does that look like, and how have you addressed that?
Yeah, I love it. I think it's super great question, and pivotal that people understand race equity, because I think, again, one of the ways whiteness plays out in thinking and in the culture of organization is in kind of either or thinking, and this kind of zero sum thinking, right? And so, in other words, either race equity is just advancing race equity, and it's not, and it's not advancing any other kinds of marginalization or other identities. And one way we work with organizations is begin to have them think about race equity in a more inclusive way. So a couple of things that are important around that question for me. One is race equity is a starting point for a larger conversation. It's not the end point, though. It's the opening, and it's the foundation. And part of the reason we talk about it being a foundation is really, for me, kind of three clear reasons. One is, and the most simple reason, is that race tends to be this very historic, kind of persistent disparity, issue, challenge, whatever you want to call it, but we don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
We're massively uncomfortable talking about it. We have all these informal rules about how to talk about it, formal rules about how to talk about it. So on the most simple reason of why should we start with the foundation around race, it's like, okay, on the most simple, it's like, okay, it allows us to isolate something that we don't know how to talk about, that is very persistent in its impact. And if we can learn how to talk about this and build agreements around how we talk about this, we are going to be able to use those same agreements to talk about almost any other form of marginalization.
Sure.
So on that end, it's that. The bigger thing for me, though, when I think about it is, I'm all about talking about gender. I'm all about talking about poverty. I'm all about talking about sexual orientation. Name the disparity. Let's have that conversation.
Yes.
But I want to have that conversation in an inclusive manner, meaning like, I don't want to pretend as if gender is experienced equally by women of color. So like, a Black woman is having the same experience as a white woman.
Sure.
A Native woman is having the same experience as a Black woman. Like all these kinds of things. So like, let's have the conversation, but let's be able to have the conversation in a way that is able to say, like,
intersectional.
Let's talk about the experience of Black women versus white women. Let's talk about the tension that exists there. Let's talk about Latinx, Latinas, and what's happening. Like, let's talk about poverty, and let's talk about the way in which poverty exists within white communities.
Yes.
And the ways in which, and I grew up in a wealthy upper middle class white area, but I was in Section 8 housing in white, so I was living in poor white. So I know firsthand, I've
Mm.
experienced the limiting nature of poverty in white communities. So let's talk about the ways as a white person in poverty, you have less opportunities, in ways in which you have way less resources, in ways in which you can't move because there's these barriers. Let's have that conversation. Let's also talk about how that exists in Black and brown communities where those same things happen. And you're also hyper criminalized, over policed, right? And mass incarcerated. It's a very different experience of
Yes.
poverty. We can talk about sexual. My mom, when she came out, I'm sure when my mom came out, she had the experience many people of color or many queer folks are having when they come out, right? But my mom was also Latina,
Mm-hmm.
raised three Muslim kids. That's a very
Mm.
different experience of coming out. uh,
Yeah, for sure.
So when we talk about how what race does as a foundation, starting out with race not only allows us to be able to, on one hand, learn how to have difficult conversations. When we start out in that way, it also allows us to talk about these other forms of marginalizations in a more
Yeah.
inclusive manner,
Yeah.
right? And then
Yeah.
finally, the thing I think is important for us to name is that, look, we were founded in a very overt way around we were built for racial disparities in a very
Yeah.
overt way, right? So for us to be able to examine the ways in which we built this country, both from a policy and a legal standpoint, built on racial inclusion, right, and a cultural set of norms and narratives that held that in place, like
Mm-hmm.
it's helpful for us to be able to look at that through a race equity lens and be able to then say, like, okay, like, and this is hard, and I think why sometimes it takes us a while to build a conscience that we were built for racial disparity. Like we have these racial disparities because we were built for a disparate
Mm.
experience in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So isolating race up front allows us to both have these conversations. It allows us to have them in an inclusive manner, and
Mm-hmm.
it allows us also to start at the foundation here of racial exclusion,
Yes.
oppression, exploitation, right? And be able to locate how those same policies, still same ways in which we're organized, are existing in our current organizations.
Yes.
But to me, it's like we're gonna get to gender. We have to, because it's an intersectional conversation.
That's right.
Race is just the starting point to get there.
You know, it's that old adage, man, that I say all the time, right? That I've heard years ago. Sort of, once we resolve race, everything else falls in place. Right? And a lot of it has to do with exactly what you said. And once you center it in the United States, or I should say, if you take a United States perspective, you know, as a legal scholar with the focus in the Constitution, I'll be the first to tell you that race is a part of it's a part of the design. I always call the United States Constitution the oldest organizational development framework that there is in the world today.
Right.
Literally. As someone who does the work and helps develop, I mean, that's exactly what it is. And the same way we say, okay, you want to have these values here and maybe a mission statement and a vision statement, they're saying we want to separate white from black, right? And way back when we declared this to be something we want to do, we're going to call these native folks savages, right? So, I mean, this language is a part of the framework. If you went on the website, their mission statement would say, three fifths, right? Right. And stuff like that. Right. So it's not, you make profound points that, why we don't know how to talk about it. It's no secret. I mean, you're not saying something that is taboo because it is, under lock and key. I mean, it's right in front of your face. Yeah, it's been amended, but the fact of the matter is that the language is there for you to digest and to hold on to. And, you said some things, I think that it's actually a really good segue to my next question. And I only have a couple more for you, Hanif, but let me take it from a different lens, right? You talked a lot about sort of why it's important to start with race and how white folks, regardless of their circumstance, sure might be coming from a different perspective, but still, I'm gleaning a little bit from what you said, but are still benefiting from privilege. I mean, Baldwin and Du Bois and all these folks were notorious for saying you might be, as a white person, you might be destitute, you might be broke, you might be indigent, but at least you're not black here. Like, you always have that to rest on. You'll always have that to sit on. Right? And a lot of that is what I'm hearing you say. You mentioned earlier, right? White supremacy is Western culture's greatest export, which is, I love that. I mean, I think that's really profound. Uh, and then I also read in an article you wrote recently, maybe at the end of last year, you said, and I'm going to quote you, far too often in race equity work, white people's learning holds central positioning. All right. So with all of this, I know this is a sort of a longer way to a question, but I wanted to make sure I can encapsulate all that because it's relevant. With your perspective on white supremacy as Western culture's greatest export and race equity work being centered around sort of white learning, sort of a level of coddling, and the understanding that white people, regardless of your circumstance, you're still going to have this privilege, even if your lived experience may not reflect that. I think the obvious question then, Hanif, is what would you believe is the expectation of white people in this work? Can they lead a DEI organization, or is that out of bounds? Should they only serve as support systems? What is the expectation for white people who are positioned in justice, whether as the beneficiary or someone who's trying to act as an advocate? Just sort of a broader question by and large.
Yeah, I love that.
It's loaded, so I recognize that.
In some ways, again, like one thing that I do this facilitation training, and where D&I practitioners kind of come from around the country, and it's meant for folks who are kind of farther along, right?
Of course,
yeah. And so this question comes up around, and it's mostly folks of color. It's like maybe 2/3, 1/3, typically, folks of color, white folks. And one of the things that I'm really clear about with folks of color is that, look, it is not your job to change a white person's mind.
Right. Yep.
And this is sometimes news for folks of color. They're like, because we feel like it's our mission to like that's our legacy we carry from the last generation, all that kind of stuff, right? And I'm coming to the white expectation in a second. So it's like, not your job to change a white person's mind. What your job is, if you choose to get into a D&I role, if you choose to get in a D&I role and you're having to work with white folks, so that if those are the conditions, right, is that your job is to cultivate the conditions upon which a mind can change.
Okay.
So that's your job. Your job is to establish a relationship with whoever you're working with. That doesn't have to be a relationship that's like we're best friends and all that kind of stuff. It does have to be a relationship built on a commitment to their growth. But again, your job is not to change your mind, and then is to cultivate those kinds of conditions, right? So whether that's asking great questions, whether that's holding them account, whatever it ends up being. White people, then, it's their job. So when you talk about what's the expectation, it's not my job to change your mind. It is the expectation that you will position yourself as a learner in this journey and act on that learning. Like that's to me the expectation. So when I think we have like some basic agreements that we adapted from Crazy's conversation. So like when I think about basic expectations, that white people will stay engaged, that white people will learn to speak their truth responsibly, that they will listen to understand non-dominant points of view, that they will be willing to experience discomfort and do things differently. Right? Like that's the expectation I have for white folks, that they're doing things differently, that they're doing things differently is coming from truly listening and engaging with non-dominant points of view and allowing and positioning themselves as a learner. So allowing that learning then to change how they act. That's the expectation to me, is that ultimately it's like, okay, all I can expect from a white person is that they're doing the very best they can. Like they're really, really trying hard to listen and learn and then do something with that learning.
Yes.
To me, it's as simple as that. Like we can go lots of layers around all of that. Like, but I think that like learning, they're going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Differently means they're going to be uncomfortable, right? It means they're going to be challenging the status quo. It means that they are going to have to stay engaged even when they don't have to.
That's right. Well, let me ask you this off that as well, Hanif. I love those expectations. I love those takeaways. Is there a line? Does a line show up? How do you know if there's a line? Where's the line between a white person who takes your feedback, right, the expectations, and who does? How do we know if this white individual is doing advocacy authentically or is still doing it from a perspective of the white savior complex? How and is that an obvious difference? I guess between the two.
It's not all. Sometimes it's obvious, right? But I think more often, I think especially white folks who are kind of moved farther along, it can be a little harder to figure out like what's your intention here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's two schools of thoughts I have on that. One is I was on this panel one time, and somehow the conversation about it was right when Disney had made the shift where they put those kind of messages before their movies that said like, "Hey,
The
this
disclaimers there, yeah.
This movie's racist."
Aladdin, such yeah, yeah. I've seen it on a few of them.
And I thought, I mean, it was kind of cool how they did that and stuff. But I remember this guy saying, like, "Look, I actually do not care why white people are doing that because I have a daughter, and the only thing I care about is that when she turns on Disney, it looks like her, sounds like her, all that kind of stuff. So if they're doing it because they think it's a whole new demographic and they're going to make more money, great. If they're going to do it because whatever, like the bottom line is the behavior changed. Why the behavior changed doesn't matter." Part of me sits with that in a big way. Like at the end of the day, the only kind of thing at the end of the day I care about is the behavior change to something.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I do think like it's like all things not either or, and it's nuance. I think when white folks are doing things to quote save folks of color, I think we still hold people of color as incapable, unable, less than, all of those kinds of things. And so I think this is part of the learning for white folks in this work, which is what is my real intention in doing this? I mean, I think it is a critical part of a white person's journey in this work is to be asking very critically, what is my intention in this? Am I doing this in a very subtle way in which allows me to still profit off of people of color? Right. So
Right.
still getting the validation that I need. I'm still profiting. I'm a good human being. Is that so? Am I just doing another version of this dance in just a little more slick way, a little more subtle way? But really, I'm still the paradigm is I am still better than you. You still need me. I am the one who can show you the way, and I am profiting off of this relationship. And as a white person want to believe that people of color don't actually understand that, know it, can't smell it a mile away, right?
Interesting.
And then as a consequence, are always going to keep me. We'll take the help, we'll do whatever, but always going to keep me in our. Or can I do this work as a white person and say, like, why am I doing this work? Because I no longer want to profit off of my integrity is on the line here, like who I am as a human being and how I operate in the world and what I create in the world or my success in the world. I no longer want to be predicated on my ability to oppress or come at the expense of people of color. Right. So can I start making decisions based on what is right for me and my own integrity? And can I redefine that for myself? And I think that's more, for me, a more powerful work, because what then happens is when when there's a moment for a white person that's encountered, that's like, okay, they're going to have to do the right thing. And it's not going to be in their best interest of doing the right thing.
Sure.
I've worked with so many leaders that I can tell, you want to know how you can tell someone's a white savior or not in this moment is wait till their bottom line is threatened. Wait till their whiteness is threatened. And then you'll know why if someone is doing, I always felt like you really don't know a white person until they're threatened.
Interesting.
Once they're threatened, their station is threatened, their comfort is threatened, or their bottom line is threatened. Now we'll get to sense of, because that saviorism tends to only work as long as they're benefiting in that relationship, so their station, all that kind of stuff. So can everyone do this because it's the right thing to do. And like all people trying to advance race equity work, it involves risks
Yeah.
because you're going to challenge the status quo. So are you willing to put your station? Are you, and again, like I work with business leaders all the time. I'm not saying throw your whole business away. Don't think smart about all this kind of stuff.
Sure. Sure.
Are you willing to challenge the status quo because it's the right way? You want to find a new way to do business. You want to find a
Right.
new way to 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 support the mission of your organization, right? So to me, those are the things that are really important, that we have to get white folks to be thinking about it in that way, because those moments are going to happen where it's going to be easy for them to just say like, no,
No, thank you.
if
Yeah.
it's not built into their integrity.
Yeah. You know, there's a theory around that. And it comes right out of critical race theory called interest convergence theory, which essentially says that, you know, white people would be willing to support the efforts of DEI so long as there's a convergence of interests. In other words, so long as I can benefit from it, so long as it doesn't get in my way, like so long as my interests are met in this process. You know, that's why you see a lot of white folks supporting the work of another department. Like, oh, yeah, honey, fantastic job. I'm happy to support you. Great job. But, you know, just don't, we're not going to do it. You know, don't bring that here. But, you know, oh, you want to adopt a kid of color? Right. Fantastic. I think that's the right thing to do. I'll never do it. That's not an example. But my point is supporting the work of DEI and racial justice is oftentimes seen from afar, but not so much in your own bubble, in your own space. And, you know, you talked about profiting from the work. And, you know, that was something that Robin DiAngelo has come under fire for quite a few times. She's come under fire for it in the past. And I think there's still remnants of that. But, you know, folks like she and Tim Wise, they take a position of speaking to white people specifically. I want to ask you this question and move on to another question before we close out. Does that change it for you at all, Hanif, your perspective? If the white person, a Robin DiAngelo, a Tim Wise, someone who positioned himself as a leader in this work, is doing the work to specifically talk to white people about white racism and the racism that they have within them, does that change the ways in which you see their ability to profit or to engage the work?
I love that question. So one quick thing before we go on the interest convergence thing. I'm a big believer in critical race theory, and that in particular, I see that again and again. And again, one of the things I think when we're doing good D&I work is there is this, again, zero sum belief, this like kind of like interest convergence kind of thing of like, if I advance race equity, it's bad for the bottom line, right? So therefore I'm not, like, or I only do and I think good work around D&I helps people reimagine things, not from an either or perspective. Like, okay, how can you as a business still get the profits you need to get, meet your bottom line goals, all those things? And can we not do it at the expense of people of color? Like, are you willing to be in that exploration?
Mm-hmm.
And can we not put things as kind of an either or? Either I'm helping advance race equity and I'm decreasing my bottom line, or I'm not doing race equity and I'm increasing my bottom line. Like, we have to get out of that either or thinking.
Yes,
for sure. And I see pockets and moments where that happens, and it actually, like, when we're able to reimagine things. So on the Robin DiAngelo side, honestly, like, here's where I'm at with that. Like, I think there is a role for white folks, and I think the number one role for white people in race equity work is to work with other white people. Like, I think that's the number one role that white people have, is to be working with other white folks on their own racial consciousness. And because if they're not doing it, then we're going to have to do it one way or the other.
Right.
And who better, right? Who's going to better to understand that? Who may have more compassion for it? Who may, all those kinds of things.
That's right.
I think where the Robin DiAngelos of the world and the Tim Wises of the world and all that stuff are irritating to me personally and frustrating to me is, and I think white people just have are magicians. Like, they always find a way to just recenter themselves in the conversation. So, like, why is, like, there are so many good, amazing voices of color that can speak to the same issues as white folks, and yet they don't know who, like, why would more people know who Robin DiAngelo is than you? if we're talking about race equity, like seriously, if we're talking about race equity,
Uh-huh.
and at the core of race equity, at the core of race equity, and let's say inclusion, is this idea that we want to center the perspectives of the people most impacted. We want to create space for them because we believe the solutions exist within that community.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to center them. We want to position them to actually be decision makers. And we want to create space for them to resolve the issues within their own community, resource, trade all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, why Robin DiAngelo, it's just another way that whiteness continues to get recentered is, Robin DiAngelo, Tim Wises of the world become these thought leaders around race equity and are making millions and millions of dollars off of it one way or the other, right? And that's not the critical voice in this conversation.
Mm.
Critical voice are the voices of folks of color, and we keep perpetuating like this idea that like who really gets standing in this conversation are ultimately a white person who can talk about this in a way that is palatable to white, and even challenge white, even if it's not palatable to white people, challenge white people. It still positions it in that kind of way.
Yeah.
And so it's a little confusing. On one hand, I think like, yes, white people love Robin DiAngelo and they listen to her and they think about things about white fragility. But I even think like some of the approach that she has around how she talks about this is still filled with whiteness in some ways. And so it's still a better than kind of conversation. Sometimes it at least feels that way.
Interesting.
Like, who knows and who doesn't know? I'm a smart white person. I know all this stuff. You
Mm.
don't, therefore you're fragile or whatever else. It's still kind of the white way of going about things, often of like, I know more, I'm better than, I'm all these things. But
Right.
So it's a little confusing. On one hand, like there are people I work very closely. We at CEI, we have white facilitators in our space that we know it's really important that they work with white folks because they have inroads. It's easier. We don't want to have people of color having to prove to white folks that racism is real.
Right. Right.
There's a huge role for white folks. I think when they start getting, but even the white folks in CEI would know, like my job is not to be the central figure at the Center for Equity and Inclusion. My job is not to have all this great standing. My job is to be creating space for folks of color to actually be having standing. So to me, I always look at what's the impact, like what's the ultimate impact. And is Robin DiAngelo, and again, like I'm just using her as a metaphor,
Yeah.
creating more standing for people of color? I don't know. Like I think they might be more willing to listen to Robin DiAngelo than they would be to you, white people would. I don't know.
I'll tell you, it's one of the courses I run on sort of inclusive organizations. Whenever white folks go to find outside research to kind of support their particular journey, they always lean on Robin DiAngelo. Not many white folks, if any, lean on some of the scholars of color out there who are saying very much the same thing, to your point earlier.
And that's both like cultural around who knows, right? It's cultural around like who is safe to learn from, right? And it's also economic and institutional around like who will publishers then fund? Like how do we get, how can a person of color get published? How can they get their voice? Well, if the belief is that only white people will there's a huge market for this, a white market for this, or D&I is $1 billion industry, but they'll really listen to Robin DiAngelo's of the world, then it's going to be 10 times as hard for you to get published.
Yes.
Right? 10 times as hard. You might be saying the exact same thing. And it's economic. Who is actually profiting from this?
Right.
Like, so somehow she is, whether she likes it or not, and whether she can name it. And she doesn't. I'm saying I'm profiting off of this. Great. I'm glad you can name it. You're still profiting off, right? Like,
right.
At the end of the day, like you're left out of a publishing industry, or you as a metaphor, right? Like we're left out of a publishing experience. We're left having to work to then, like, could you say things in the same tone, like in the same tone as Robin DiAngelo white people? Like, or is that only for white people? So it's like, it's problematic in a lot of different ways. Cultural level for me. And again, it's a good example of how white people don't have to try. Like you can be advancing race equity and perpetuating it at the same time.
That's right.
And to me, I see the Tim Wises and the Robin DiAngelos as doing that.
Interesting.
And not, and again, I will say this again. I think white people have a tremendous role to be working and educating other white people.
Hmm.
I think we've got to be looking at how they do that, and is at the end of the day, at the end of the day, is that work actually creating more space and opportunity for folks of color to lead this work?
That's right. That's right.
Like
I
people
can.
of color should only be leading this work. They should be in the driver's seat. White folks should be in the passenger seat at
Yeah.
all times.
Okay. Yeah. That's a piece of what was at the core of the question. Yeah, for sure. Man, we could talk about so much more.
And this is my point of view. People may see it different. This is how I see it.
No, no, I feel you. And that's what I want. That's what we want. And I think anybody who lives a marginalized identity, especially that as a person of color, will understand, including myself, why people of color need to be in the driver's seat, for sure. Uh, and information is power. In my experience, the majority reason for pushback around these conversations around DEI and racial justice, above all else, is due to misinformation. There's a reason why states who are banning CRT are also banning social emotional intelligence work, because if you can empathize with the narrative, then it would obviously make sense. I mean, CRT by definition is, as you know, is just telling you that, race is baked into all of the institutions, legal, systemic, academic in the United States. And we need to be mindful of that as we consider reimagining these things, right? Free from some of the nuances. That's basically the point of it. So for a white person to take that and say this means that all white people are evil is you're not listening. You know what I mean? You're misinformed, right? So if you have the information, then it stands to reason why, to your point, it would make sense why people of color would be in the driving seat. Not to mean that that's tantamount or akin to carrying the burden and wearing the burden and load, but directing the ship, absolutely. There's so much more to cover. I'm going to pass on a question for the sake of time, Hanif, and I'm going to go to my final question here, which is that you have a book in the works, something forthcoming down the road that's very much framed around the vision you have for your daughter, Amina. Mm-hmm. Two things here. Talk a little bit about the book and to whatever extent you would like. I know it's on the way, and talk about what it means to be a dad, man. And for me, that's clear to me that it's a big part of your identity. As a father myself, I wouldn't trade it for the world. As a dad of color, more than anything, talk a little bit about the book, the vision, and then what it means to be a dad to a young lady of color and just a father of color, and what that means to you.
So the book coming out next fall, pub date we should know next couple months. We're working on the title right now. I like the title we have, but the publishers aren't so sure. So we'll see what the title is.
Okay.
And we'll go from there. But
okay.
Really, the book, what I wanted to do with the book, one of the things that I see, and this connects to the Robin DiAngelo conversation, which was unintentionally in DNI. I think DNI is in a really interesting spot, and a very tentative spot. It's, obviously $1 billion industry. And yet I think if you asked if you pull people of color who are in businesses that are doing DNI work, my bet is 75 to 80% of those people of color would say, I don't have any part of DNI in my organization. And I think it's both part of like the last 5 years and just being tired and exhausted of this, but also some of the unintentional ways in which these conversations tend to center white learning. That's kind of constant. And oftentimes that learning is at the expense of folks of color.
Yes. So, almost always.
Right. And so, and one of the unintentional things that happens in that is that folks of color even take on that all DNI is educating white folks as if there's no work for us to do. And there is so much work for us to do. There's so much work when it comes to Black-Brown relationships, when it comes in terms of our own sexism or homophobia that lives in our communities.
Internalized racism within our own community. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. All of our
colorism.
How we coped with all of that. How we heal. How we navigate a system that is like at every turn is kind of oppressive in one way or the other. So there is massive amount of work for us to do as a community of color, and it never gets centered. There's no conversation for it or space for it. So really recognized that in all my conversations with folks of color. And I wanted to write a book. Also, the other thing that always comes up is lots of the books I've read are always about how we're just surviving or kind of, making it in spite of all those things. And I think there's a space for all those books and for us to connect with other groups. I wanted to write a book that was about us and for us and written to us. So I'm not that I don't think there's a lot of value for white folks. I think there is, but I'm not doing a lot of explaining for white folks of certain things. There's
Mm,
things that are left unsaid that you're only going to know probably if you're a person of color. And I'm
that's right.
not prioritizing white comfort in this book. It's
Oh,
really like it's a book that is really at the end of the day focused on the relationships that we need to forge if we're really going to thrive, or create something new. So it's following me as I'm intersecting both in education spaces and workspaces and in home spaces, um, with a number of folks from different race and ethnic backgrounds. And it's just tracking what those different relationships, what are happening in those relationships, and what about those relationships allowed for us to create something really special, whether it's a youth program or whether it's a CI or whatever it ends up being. So it really is. It's funny because so many people wanted me to write a book on D and I, because we're, but
so
what
yeah,
we're constantly, everybody that we work with is like, hey, this work can't be done out of relationship. Like it has to be done in relationship. And so
mm,
I wanted a book that could really be about what does it mean for us to reimagine a world
hmm,
in which reimagine a black and brown centered world. what what would that world be like? Like that's when I think about my mission statement in life, it is helping being an architect of a black and brown centered world.
yes,
And I don't think we'll ever get there. But what I do know is if we're going to create that kind of world, it's only going to be done in relationship. And we are out of relationship right now. Like I'm talking about black and brown folks,
mm,
right?
hmm,
If I think there's so much anti-blackness running through brown communities that we need to explore and unpack. There's, biases happening in the black community around, like there's all kinds of stuff, and there's good, rich work to do. So I wanted to have a story be out there about what does that look like for us? When we're doing our work, what does that look like? And what is the impact of when we really are in relationship around that? So
yes.
that's the book. It's coming out. It's a little different. It's not what people expected, but I think I'm really, really, really excited about it.
I love that.
And
Give
then
me a little.
fatherhood is central.
Yeah, go for
Yeah,
it.
fatherhood
Yeah,
is to me and to the book. There's 4 letters to Amina in the book that kind of capture the learning I've had. But to
nice.
me, I'll say this about fatherhood: there is no other identity that I hold that comes close to the identity that I have as a father of color. Like that is the most central
It's unbelievable,
identity.
isn't it?
Yeah, like it shapes every single thing I do goes through an Amina filter. And
Sure.
so for me, Amina and being a father of color is both like holds me accountable to being the
Hmm.
very best human being I can be, and constantly thinking like, am I being who Amina needs me to be right now? Am I modeling to her what's possible for us?
That's right.
All of that. And as just a parent, growing up in the way I grew up, all that kind of stuff, there's just, um, I think one of the things the book is exploring is this idea of joy. And one of the things that I've really learned is, over this journey, is that joy and us finding joy is race equity work. And it's exploring what is that. And one of the things I'm, talking to folks in the book, really realize that joy is found in these relationships, not in things that we acquire, but in these relationships.
Yes.
And so for Amina and my role with her, like there is no greater experience of joy than like being on a soccer field with her late at night and talking to her, or like
Right.
reading a book with her late at night, or like hugging her at night, or all these kinds of things. It's been the one true experience of joy, that I've had in my life. So it's just like both from a race equity standpoint, she's that next generation, and she keeps me thinking about you know, who I need to be in the world and all that stuff. But from a personal place, there is no greater place of joy than being a father of color. Like that's it.
I couldn't agree more, man. I really, really appreciate that. I always like to, if I have men of color on who are fathers, I always like to carve some space for that question, because we need to hear it. We need to empower one another in that. There's a lot of tropes or stereotypes and a lot of challenges that Black men and brown men who are dads experience and face. And, the more we can normalize the beauty of fatherhood, the more we can talk about that, sure, the challenges present themselves, but they also hold us accountable, like you said, and change the way we can perceive things. I think the more we'll be able to shift the narrative from sort of absenteeism to very much a presence and an effective presence at that in our kids' lives. Hanif, man, that's it. I really appreciate you taking some time to come kick it with me. Before I let you go ahead and tell people where they can find you, websites, hashtags, social media handles, anything like that.
Anything, if the work is resonating, you can get in touch with us at ceipdx.com. And you can just find me on Instagram. I'm not super active on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm on there, but you can find me on Instagram. And I should know I'm so bad at this. I should know my Instagram. Hanif Fazal. There's only so many Hanif Fazals. Find me on there.
Okay.
My face.
If not else,
this one you can tell I'm old. I didn't know this. I have someone helping me with my social media. She's going to kill me.
It's all good. I appreciate you, Hanif, man. Thank you so much for taking some time to kick it with us on the Chopping Block. Everybody, of course, my listeners, have a wonderful day. Dr. Sherrod Robbins here with Hanif Fazal, and you're on the Chopping Block at visceralchange.org.